My breath hitched as the room went quiet and the projector blinked to life. Everyone expected a show, but I already knew my lines had been taken away. My name is Marcus Hale, I am 38, and for 7 years I led product engineering, building the demo that had become the heartbeat of our sales meetings. I watched the soft rectangle of light scatter across polished wood and felt the hollowing sensation that comes when something you built is about to be performed without you. The hum of the HVAC settled into the same steady note it always did in big rooms like this, but the familiar comfort of routine had thinned into something sharp. I had lived by rituals for years. Mornings meant black coffee that tasted faintly of burnt hope, a stack of code review notes, and the small superstition of aligning my keyboard and mouse the exact same way on my desk. My wife joked that my laptop was an extra child, and I laughed in a way that made the joke true. Colleagues leaned on that machine when deadlines snarled. They dropped in at odd hours and left half-formed questions in my inbox because they trusted me to turn questions into clarity. The demo was more than a feature showcase. It was a fragile piece of theater I had spent months sculpting, rehearsing transitions until gestures were smooth and explanations felt inevitable. I had chosen every pixel, coaxed every animation, and smoothed the internal logic until the whole thing told the story I thought the product deserved. Right now the room smelled like fresh paper and recycled tension. Investors sat in neat rows, phones face down, posture ambiguous between boredom and hunger. The founder sat front row, palms flat on his knees, an expression I had learned to read like code but never like scripture. Someone adjusted the lighting and the projector sent a pulse that made everyone lean forward, the way people do when they expect performance and not confession. My hands rested in my lap. My voice was an instrument I had tuned for years, and for reasons that felt obvious to me, I was suddenly expected to play along but not explain any notes. Why did it matter so much? Because the demo was where stories stuck. A good walkthrough turned prospects into believers and believers into committed checks. It was where my team's countless late nights and brittle compromises became something watchable, persuasive, and fundable. When the demo landed, pipelines opened. When it failed, months of careful work dissolved into excuses that never named the sleeplessness or the people who had saved features at the 11th hour. I had learned how important it was to control the narrative, not for ego, though there had been some, but because acknowledgement was how my team could pay rent, plan lives, and keep making things. Those tiny, tangible validations were the currency we traded in. Before today, the company had been something like a family of convenience. There were inside jokes and shared takeout orders, grudging praise, and the kind of small mentorships that changed the trajectory of careers. I remembered our first real win, the night we debugged a critical failure with nothing but a flashlight app and a whiteboard marker. People high-fived in the kitchen, and someone wrote our product name on a post-it and stuck it to the coffee machine like a consecration. We celebrated as if gratitude could harden into safety. I believed in the work and in the few people who mattered to me there. I trusted that when the lights went on, the truth of the demo would be the truth everyone agreed to tell. Sitting in the dark, though, I felt that trust bending. The air tasted metallic, like a coin clutched too tight. Old memories of collaborative triumphs brushed against an unexpected present where decisions seemed to be made in quiet rooms with smiling smiles. My chest tightened when I thought about the months I had given, the late weekends, and the voice in the back of my head that cataloged who had come through and who had walked away. I could hear, clear as a notification ping, the sound of people thanking me in private and then looking elsewhere in public. That pattern had not been a catastrophe before. It had been an aggravation I managed with more code and quieter conversations. Tonight felt different because the stakes were louder than the usual office politics. Investors were here. The demo could reframe everything. I had practiced this walkthrough until my explanations felt automatic and my answers were sharper than discontent. I knew where to pause so the product could shine, where to quicken so curiosity would ride the momentum. My scripts were compartmentalized and my backups were redundant. I had built fail-safes because I could not afford improvisation in a room like this. Yet despite all the preparation, an empty seat had started to occupy the space where my authority should have been. The projector light smudged across the table, and for the first time in a long time, I realized that building something was not the same as controlling the story it told. I had always assumed belief was mutual. The sound of the room inhaling told me I might be wrong. I sat there and felt the simplest, most human fear, that my work could be taken, reshaped, and given a new voice while mine was told to be silent. 2 days before the demo, I was called into the glass conference room on the third floor like someone who'd been summoned for a traffic citation. The CEO sat at the head of the table under a light that made everyone look a degree paler. The founder's owner sat to his left, thumbs worrying a ballpoint, and a couple of VPs flanked them like punctuation. I knew why I was there before I walked in. Every calendar invite with investor in the subject carried a quiet weight, but knowing and accepting were different things. Marcus, the CEO said without looking up, "We want you to run the demo, but keep it tight. Don't elaborate on the design decisions. Speak less. Silence will make the product look more polished." He said it like it was strategy, as if silence were an aesthetic choice instead of an erasure. I felt my mouth go dry. He told me to play the walkthrough and answer technical questions if pressed, but to leave the wire trade-offs, the late-night hacks that made the UI behave, off the stage. He framed it as protecting the narrative. The simpler the story, the cleaner the sales pitch. I swallowed. Outwardly, I agreed. I had learned that bargaining in that room led to small compromises that never stopped asking for more. 2 hours later, as if to punctuate the decision, the owner's favored nephew was introduced to the team with the sort of gleeful pride you reserve for family dogs at a birthday party. He'd flown in for rehearsals with a borrowed suit, and someone had pressed a mic into his hand. He smiled with the practiced absence of someone who'd been told to smile. He was going to be the face. I would be officially the man behind the curtain. I walked back toward my desk, negotiating a politeness that felt like glue. When I passed the CEO's office again, the door was cracked. His voice leaked out, casual and low, the way people sound when they assume only friends are listening. He was on the phone. "Yeah, don't worry about the engineering credit," he was saying. "We'll minimize their contributions. Let the story be simple. If anyone asks, it's all presentation. Hell, if the nephew can front it without tripping, swap the team, save us the drama." Hearing my work reduced to something to be minimized, and hearing a person I'd trusted suggest swapping my team like a hat, knocked the air from my lungs. The world narrowed to his words: minimize, swap, save us the drama. It landed in me as if someone had plucked a guitar string tuned to the exact frequency of my pride and let it snap. I stood there, hands on the glass, and felt stupid for standing motionless on a floor that had always felt solid. The betrayal was physical. I could taste metal. My chest tightened as if someone had folded a blanket across it. For a moment, I imagined saying something, opening the door and telling him he was wrong, but the scene replayed itself in thin slices of reason. The investor stakes, the owner's trust, the nephew's smile. Saying anything would be career-loud and absurd. I left, fingers numb, and walked the rest of the day as if the carpet were moving under my feet. In the days that followed, the polite scaffolding of workplace niceties began to crumble. The casual nods in the kitchen turned into quick, distracted greetings. People who had once pinged me for help left messages on the board that suddenly went to other engineers. The emails of appreciation I used to collect like tiny deposit slips, "Thanks for jumping in at 2 a.m., shrunk into perfunctory, nice demo notes that never mentioned the parts I had rebuilt. Meetings I used to chair were reassigned to the product VP. The nephew practiced smiles at the podium while I was routed to the developer support room to make sure the live systems looked seamless. Humiliation arrived in small, precise cuts. I presented a bug fix at a cross-functional stand-up and felt the founder take credit in the way people do when they're marking territory. He explained my work in abstracts and left out the name on the ticket. A junior product manager who had asked me for mentorship months before started avoiding the table where I sat during lunch. Once, in the hallway, someone I had helped onboard smiled past me and asked after my weekend as if we had not collaborated for years, then walked on without waiting for my answer. The silence around me was louder than any argument. It hummed with the suggestion that maybe I was the one who'd misread things. What stung the most was not anger, but the sudden isolation, how the place I'd built my life around could become a room full of strangers. The demonstration I'd slated to be our collective proof of value was being repackaged as theater, and the people who had relied on that proof for their next moves were being shepherded to applaud the performance instead of the makers. I could feel my role shrinking into an uncredited footnote. Weeks of casual nods and grateful emails evaporated into awkward avoidance and whispered doubts about my future with the company. I sat at the kitchen table long after the rest of the apartment had gone quiet. The the lamp throwing a cone of tired yellow over my laptop and a half-empty mug of coffee that had gone from hot to bitter to an excuse for a hand to hold. The recording file sat in the corner of my desktop like a wound I kept picking at, small, local, not meant for anyone's ears but mine. I hadn't planned to listen to it again. I told myself I'd kept it only so I could remember exact timings and cues for the demo. But the memory of the CEO's laugh in the hallway had looped through my head all day like a stuck record. I clicked play. At first it was just ambient office noise, the faint shuffle of papers, a chair creak, the city's muted evening siren in the background. Then his voice cut through, calm, conversational, the way people explain things to themselves when they're arranging the world to suit them. "Minimize their contributions," he said casually. "Let the story be simple. If anyone asks, it's all presentation. Swap the team if we have to save us the drama." Hearing those words spoken aloud, stripped of the theater of the glass room and the rehearsed smiles, had a different weight. In person, there was room for nuance, for things to be massaged into compromise. In a recording, there was only the phrase, the expression, the intent without pretense. Each syllable landed like a pebble in a glass bowl. Clear, cold, impossible to unhear. I listened again, compulsively, as if repetition might somehow change the inflection, reveal a joke I'd missed. It didn't. The casual cruelty was there in full. Something inside me steadied, as sudden and merciless as the click of a lock. It wasn't righteous anger at first, not the fireworks I imagined in my head when I fantasized about confronting him. It was a quieter, more precise thing. An assessment of what silence would mean. If I played along the agreed-upon tight demo, the scripted pauses, the omission of why we had made the unglamorous choices that kept the UI from melting down, then I would be complicit. Everyone in that room would leave with applause and a story that erased the scaffolding, the late nights, the bugs we'd wrestled into submission. They would hand the applause to a nepotistic face and call it narrative discipline. My team's labor would be tidied into an illusion. I thought of the people who had stayed late because I asked them to, who had shifted anniversaries and birthdays to hit a sprint target. I saw in my mind's eye the whiteboard in the war room, edges smudged from fingers tracing through syntax in the small hours, Maddie's exasperated jokes about my coffee-fueled decrees, Sanjeev's careful comments that always made the code mean something. Those were not abstractions, they were people. The demo wasn't a performance. It was the accumulation of their nights and arguments and stubborn, incremental victories. To let it be relabeled as presentation felt like watching a street vendor's cart being photographed for a glossy magazine while the vendor was ushered off camera. I ran through options like a mechanic disassembling a clock. I could complain HR, legal, the board boxes to tick, processes that favored procedure over truth. But the same room that had casually rearranged my credit for the demo was the room that framed protecting the narrative as prudence. My complaint could be absorbed, softened, turned into another memo about team dynamics. I could hand it over to the VPs and let them escalate it into a formality that would soothe the owner and leave my team in the footnotes. I could also walk away, take a silent moral high road, let the erosion happen, preserve my pay, my title, and the comfortable scaffolding of my life, all at the cost of watching someone else stand in the light while my people were shunted into the wings. I thought of the nephew on the podium less as an antagonist and more as a symbol of the choice being made on behalf of convenience. He'd been handed a script and a smile. He'd been given the performance without the labor. The thought made me angry in a way that was less about him and more about the system we'd built together, how easy it was to convert craftsmanship into optics when the people at the top valued the shine over the work. That anger, once it settled, became a moral clarity. This wasn't about theatrics or ego, it was about truth as currency. If the demo became a weapon to rewrite the story of our work, then silence would mean the theft of that truth. I could already imagine the investors' follow-up emails, the product write-ups that would escort the nephew's smile across press releases, the resume bullets that would quietly omit whole teams. In a culture that prized narrative, being erased was a slow form of drowning. I sat with the fear for a long time, the practical, pulsing fear of losing everything I'd stacked into this career. The status, the paycheck, the routines that anchored my days. I thought about my wife, who had joked about my laptop being an extra child but who also relied on what we earned. I imagined the gossip, the HR meetings, the quiet estrangements that followed any act of dissent. But underlying those practical worries was a softer, sharper thing that mattered more to me than comfort, my sense of integrity. Would I let the story be stolen because it would be easier to keep my schedule? Would I let a lie about our work stand because reframing it saved us the drama? When the coffee finally cooled from bitter to cardboard, I made a smaller, simpler decision before I made a plan. I would not be silent, not because I wanted the spectacle of retribution, but because letting silence stand would be complicity. I would find some way to let the truth live where it belonged, so the hands that had built our product could be seen. The rest of the night I stared at the dark window and tried to imagine what that looked like, turning the resolution over and over until its edges were sharp enough to act upon. I treated the 48 hours that followed like a surgical prep. Everything had to be sterile, precise, and invisible to anyone who might think to poke around. I began by inventorying what I could touch without creating a paper trail. A spare laptop I kept in the trunk for DMOS that went sideways, a commuter coat with a deep pocket that had once sheltered a sandwich and a train ticket, a bag of adapters and dongles that had lived under my desk for years. I packed the laptop in the coat and wrapped the bag of cords around it like bandages. The coat smelled faintly of rain and old coffee, which felt right because what I was doing was messy and needed to look ordinary. Next, I dealt with the recording. The crude, raw file I had saved at home was too obvious to plant the way it was. A naive forensic glance at metadata would have shown recording date and the device, timestamps that would have told a narrative I did not want to offer to the company. I copied the audio to the spare laptop and used software to render it into a new file, stripped of metadata and saved under an innocuous name. I warped the container so the file would play on the conference system without invoking any suspicious formats. I tested it until the playback sounded identical to the original in cadence and clarity, but without any digital fingerprints that could be traced easily back to my phone or my living room. Then I wrote a small script to do a very specific thing. The idea was elegant for its simplicity. When a benign file named AV-test-mp4 was launched on the conference machine, the script would simultaneously trigger the hidden audio, routing it through the room speakers as if it were part of the test. I used the language I knew well, the one that made me feel competent again. A few lines of code, nothing pretty but reliable. The script pings the local audio output, starts the file, logs a short event locally so I could verify it had run, and then exits. No network calls, no remote access, no alert to it if someone inspected the logs later. It was built to be both subtle and contained. I could not do any of it alone. There were obvious reasons for that, the first being a degree of technical oversight the AV team imposed in the conference center. The second being my own need for a second set of hands I trusted completely. I thought of Maddie at first because she would have laughed and done it without asking, but she was frozen by loyalty and caution in ways I understood and resented in equal measure. Then I thought of Priya, our junior engineer who had joined the team 6 months ago and still believed, wide-eyed, that the company could mean its better promises. She owed me a favor for a reference I had written when she applied for a grant. I called her and kept the call short and quiet. I did not tell her everything because secrecy was itself a shield, but I told her enough that the demo we had built deserved to be understood, that the story being prepared was dishonest, and that she could help make sure the truth was heard. She agreed without drama. Her voice on the line was steady in a way I envied. We met in the lab after hours to rehearse the mechanics. Priya would be in the AV closet, pretending to be running the sound check. She would launch AV test MP4 as part of that routine, and the script would do the rest. I explained how to isolate the projector feed if someone tried to cut the audio, where the backups would be stored, and what to do if the main feed refused to play. She memorized the few lines of instruction I gave her and refused to let me record them. That refusal felt like a tiny oath between us. I practiced my delivery until my hands stopped wanting to sprint across the keyboard. I stood in my bathroom and spoke to the mirror after the lab shutdowns had emptied the building and the only light left was the bathroom sensor flickering on. I worked on the cadence of explanation, the moments to breathe, the way to frame answers so investors would hear the engineering decisions instead of the gloss. I made lists of questions they might ask and wrote crisp, short responses that could be delivered without the tremor that sat behind my teeth. The first time I rehearsed, I read too fast, adrenaline turning the sentences into a tumble. The fifth time, I could feel the words land in the same place in my chest, calm and sure. I also prepared the demo to be practically stubborn in its clarity. The last thing I wanted was a stumble that would be used as leverage against me. I set up two redundant systems, the spare laptop with the cleaned audio and the script, and a mirrored version of the demo on a flash drive hidden in the bouquet of cables under my coat. If the conference network choked, I would plug into the projector directly. If the AV team tried to intercept screen sharing, Priya was authorized to flip the room to my input. I walked through each failure path with her until the contingency became a muscle memory. The goal was not chaos. The goal was precise exposure and the least collateral damage possible to the scaffolding of the meeting. Secrecy was essential. I did not send emails about this plan. I did not leave notes on the whiteboard. I erased every trace I could leave. Confronting them beforehand would have ensured the plan never saw light, and that was the point. Truth could be shouted down if given time to be softened. The mechanics of what I was about to do required the illusion of the regular course of business. So I folded my coat with the laptop inside, rehearsed the calm lines one more time in the mirror, and went to bed with my phone on silent and my hands still humming from the work of building something that would speak when the room was supposed to be listening to someone else. When the day arrived, I stood behind the curtain of stage monitors and watched the nephew take center stage, polished and smiling. He moved as if he had been rehearsed into someone else, the kind of practiced ease that comes from reciting lines until your face forgets the nerves beneath. The room smelled of old coffee and new ink, and the projector light threw a pale rectangle across a sea of attentive faces. He clicked through the slides with the exact cadence the CEO wanted, the investor pitch made tidy and bright. I could feel my fingers against the worn fabric of my coat where the spare laptop nestled, my signal ready on a key I had hidden under a thumb. When the slide flipped to a plain screen labeled Live Walkthrough, the timing was perfect. Priya in the AV closet breathed and hit the test file the way we had rehearsed. The conference speakers filled with the CEO's voice, unvarnished and casual, describing a plan to minimize contributions and let the story be simple. The words landed like a stone dropped into a quiet pond. Conversations stopped mid-breath. Someone in the front row shifted and muttered something I could not catch. For a moment, the only sound in the room was that voice, mundane and brutal, explaining how they would gaslight the presentation into a performance. The nephew's hand stilled over the mouse. His smile thinned to a line, and his eyes darted toward the back of the room like a child looking for an adult who would tell him this was a rehearsal. The polite posture of the audience collapsed into something raw. People exchanged glances, phones came up to record from pockets and purses, and a ripple of anger or disbelief passed across a cluster of investors. I felt the air constrict around my throat, but the script in my head, the lines I had practiced in the bathroom and the lab, sat ready behind my teeth. I stepped forward. It felt less dramatic in motion than I had rehearsed. It was simply a decision to walk through a door I had always told myself I would not open. I pulled the nephew aside with a hand at his elbow, not hard but insistently enough to remove him from the center of attention. He looked at me as if he had been caught in a lie he did not understand, and then looked at the stage as if he imagined someone else would fix it. I spoke to him softly, told him to sit, and introduced myself to the room with the kind of calm that had earned me the right to be heard. "Good morning," I said, and the room leaned forward because they had already been given a reason to listen. I identified myself, explained that I led product engineering, and said plainly that the walkthrough would be unvarnished. The audio continued like a soundtrack from another scene, the CEO's words now a counterpoint that made everything else sharper. I began the demo. I moved through the product the way I always had, hands translating thought into mouse clicks, code into behavior. I started with the architecture because architecture is a language investors understand when it is explained in terms of risk and scale. I showed the ingestion pipeline and the way we deduplicated noisy signals. I brought up latency metrics and talked about the trade-offs we had made between throughput and accuracy. When an investor asked about failure modes, I did not flinch. I outlined decay paths, monitoring hooks, and how we rerouted traffic in case of service degradation. I credited specific engineers by name, calling Priya out for the script she had written and Omar for the memory leak patch that had saved us during the beta. Naming people anchored the technical detail and human labor. There was no room left for a polished fiction when the evidence, the code, and the people were standing in the light. People asked the hard questions the CEO had said were better left unanswered. How do you validate the model under adversarial inputs? How do you protect the data and still enable rapid iteration? What maintenance cadence do you imagine when customers scale by orders of magnitude? Each time I answered, I leaned into the data we had gathered: benchmarks, post-mortem summaries, customer notes we had anonymized and aggregated. I used the short, clear sentences I had practiced. My hands stopped trembling because my explanations had work inside them. The demo did not stutter. It behaved like a living thing that had been tended carefully. The nephew drifted to the edge of the stage, watching as if the scene were unfolding without him. He opened his mouth a few times to say something, to reclaim the script, but the room had already decided where its attention belonged. The audio undercut the very premise of his role, and there was a visible recalibration in the faces around me. Men and women who had been dating slides with polite nods were now furiously scribbling notes. Someone shouted a follow-up question from the back, and I answered it directly. When the CEO stood up to speak from the audience, the voice in the speakers synchronized with his mouth, making his attempt to interject sound like an echo, like an apologetic afterthought. At some point between one question and the next, I realized I was no longer trying to prove myself to the room. I was trying to match what the team had built with the truth about how it had been built. I was translating the work into a language investors could act on, and the truth seemed to thicken the air. The audio was playing as truth, and my work spoke louder than any sewn-in narrative. The aftermath hit like a second storm. Investors left the room speaking in clipped sentences and lined up at the back to demand explanations. Emails poured in with subject lines that said urgency in all caps. HR asked me to come in and give a formal account of what had happened, to provide timestamps and to hand over what evidence I had. They framed it as standard procedure, a neutral curtain of process, but underneath the neutral tone I could hear the worry about liability. The CEO stopped smiling in meetings. It was a small thing and it felt enormous. He still talked, still scheduled strategy sessions, but the easy warmth that had lubricated every interaction with him had evaporated. The nephew retreated into the sort of quiet you give someone who has been exposed to their own limits. He kept his head down for a week, then took a leave that was described as personal. I could not tell whether he felt shame, fear, or simply the relief of stepping away from a role he had not earned. There was real cost. Board members demanded private briefings. A lead investor asked for a full review of governance and communications. A couple of smaller funds paused their term sheets and asked for more diligence. I do not pretend the company was unscathed. People called me reckless and insubordinate. An office manager who had always smiled at me sideways stopped making eye contact. A few teammates told me privately that I had saved the truth and probably saved their careers, and those conversations were small islands of ease in a sea of awkwardness. Others whispered that I had created a spectacle the company did not need, that my breach of protocol had threatened payroll. The split was ugly because it was personal. It was not just about policy. It was about where each person wanted to place themselves when truth and convenience took opposite sides. I slept poorly for the first 2 weeks. Sleep would come for an hour and then my chest would kick awake. Sometimes I woke with the words from the CEO still in my ears. Other times I woke to the sound of my own voice explaining a corner of the code to a hypothetical investor. My wife was steady and furious in the way only someone who loves you and knows your stubbornness can be. She reminded me that the risk had been real and that the consequences might come in ways we could not predict. She also held me while I tried to explain why I could not let them sell a story that would erase the people who built the thing. Her anger was a ballast against my rationalizations. I had rehearsed my moral argument until it felt familiar, but the personal losses that followed surprised me most. Rebuilding trust with the clients we could not afford to lose became a daily task. I set up back-to-back calls, walked through the architecture, handed over logs and postmortems, and invited customers to watch the live systems while I talked them through failure modes and monitoring. I took the time to listen when clients described how they used the product in ways we had not anticipated. Those conversations were the most honest we had had in years. Investors who had iced their checks came back with pointed questions and cautious appreciation once they saw the depth of instrumentation and the cadence of our releases. A few funds formally re-engaged, not because they liked the drama, but because the evidence showed a team that knew its system and respected the limits of its design. Within weeks, my team began to receive the recognition it had been denied in that room. Our names started appearing in follow-up decks. An analyst published a short piece that credited the engineering team with the scale improvements we had achieved. Priya got an introduction to an engineering director at a client, and Omar was asked to consult on a memory optimization for another startup. These were small restorations, but they mattered. They felt like reattaching threads that had been pulled loose. I also had to confront parts of myself that I had kept in the dim corners. For years, I had avoided public confrontation. I had preferred quiet competence to theater. I had told myself that the work should speak and that recognition would follow. The day I let the audio play, I learned that silence can be a kind of consent and that the belief in quiet competence can be an excuse to let others write your story. I learned that I could be brave and still be cautious, and that sometimes courage is a line you choose to walk rather than a suit you put on. There were friendships that frayed, and in a couple of cases they did not mend. People who had been allies before the incident now avoided lunch invitations. I do not think their distance was a moral indictment of me so much as a measure of their discomfort with conflict. The experience taught me about how fragile reputation is when people choose convenience over truth. It is simpler to keep smiling and to move forward on a polished fiction. It is harder to admit the mess and to take responsibility for the cleanup. I paid a cost for insisting on the harder path. What surprised me was the kind of closure I found. It was not the cinematic vindication I had imagined in quieter hours. It was a small, tight satisfaction that came when Priya sent a message saying a client had thanked her by name, when an investor forwarded an email praising our technical transparency, when my team gathered in the room after an all-hands and we let ourselves say out loud that we had been seen. The work I had poured myself into was no longer being stolen with a smile. That mattered. The truth had weight, and it reshaped the arcs that others had been drawing for us. I did not emerge unscathed, but I emerged with the knowledge that silence is a choice and that some stories are worth contesting, even if contesting them costs sleep, favors, and easy friendships.